Okay, so I think we should get started. We're on time. Wow, that's a terrific echo. Is it always that bad? All right, not used to that. All right, welcome everybody. We're here to describe the list app a little more. Hopefully you've all sat in on the earlier session by Kathleen to get a demo of this wonderful tool. We're here to find out, what's behind the curtain and how this actually works, which is itself very interesting. I've got an echo here, so hold on. All right, so let's get started. I'm Vince Barreau. I'm an architect with EBSCO and the FOLIO project. With me is Matt Weaver, who's our lead developer on this application. We also have PK Jacob, who was formerly the lead developer on the project, but also one of our key advisors here. Hopefully, PK, you're online. So we'll get started. So, how does that work? So this is the agenda that you guys have seen, the abstract for the talk. Let's skip past that. So just a quick reminder, in case you did not sit in on Kathleen's talk earlier, the FOLIO Lists application, it provides very specific functionality, basically the ability to create these ad hoc lists. You can persist the lists, you can update them, and using these lists, you can perform certain workflows within the library. And many of you may be familiar with similar functionality from another ILS, and this will hopefully fill the gap on the FOLIO project. Now, the interesting thing about lists is they basically pull in data from multiple sources within FOLIO. And as we all know, FOLIO is a microservice architecture, and we have these boundaries that exist between the modules and their individual storages. So we have to find ways around that. So the question is, how does it work? And the easy answer, as you see, is, well, it works very well. But seriously, how does it work? So the magic behind the curtains is that we have the list app, which is basically a standard list application consisting of a number of modules, front-end modules, back-end modules, and actually a UI plugin module. But behind the scenes, there's another component, which we're calling FQM. And this is the one that's doing the heavy lifting that empowers the list app. FQM. So what is FQM? FQM is an acronym. It stands for the FOLIO Query Machine. So essentially, it offers some APIs that allows these other modules, such as the ones in the list app, to access FOLIO data. FQM is internal to FOLIO, so it is itself part of FOLIO, consists of its own modules. It does not require the movement of large sets of data. So in other words, because it's in FOLIO, we don't need to export the data, make it available in another system, and then have it be accessed there. And that ensures that the data is basically up to date at all times. We don't have a synchronization delay of any sort. Now, again, FQM works across modules. So let's talk about some key concepts in FQM before we go too far down the technology stack. So FQM deals with record sets, which each record is made of data fields. This is your standard database lingo. We have another term here, which I'm not sure if it'll stick to this, but for now, it's called the entity type, which is essentially the way to define a queryable relation within FOLIO. In other words, you can compose a request for a set of data that returns a number of data fields. These data fields may come from different sources, and we refer to that answer as an entity type. The key notion is that all entity types have an identifier ID field. The query is obviously, like in most databases, it's the way for you to request a set of records from the system. So here's a new one. FQM uses FQL for its query syntax. I'm sure you're all familiar with FQL. Well, what is FQL? FQL is the full FQM query language. So FQM uses a query syntax which is closely related to the one that is available in document databases like MongoDB. So it's not your typical SQL structures, but what it is highly optimized for the kind of data that we have in Folio now, which is, as you probably all know, we store data records in Folio in JSON format and JSON-B columns in Postgres. So that is what FQL is, and in particular, in addition to lining up well with the requirements of the database and how the data is stored, it also is able to provide a better solution for how a UI can be built around it. In other words, to build things that want to help you compose an FQL query, it is actually better to use this kind of syntax, which is, I would guess, maybe the reason why Mongo invented this thing in the first place. A question may come up here, and why not use CQL? That's what we use in many places in Folio. CQL was looked at, but CQL is sort of optimized for relational databases and data sets, and it doesn't always do a very good job with the kind of structured JSON data that we have in Folio, especially when you start nesting things very deeply. So here's an example. This is a query that how it might look in FQM, composed in FQL syntax. As you can see, it's kind of a reverse notion of how we do things with SQL, but it is relatively clear in itself what is being achieved here, where you essentially have some conditions where you need a particular field, in this case, item status, to be in the following array. You'll notice that it's very JSON-like, so that's sort of confirming how it lines up with the JSON-B data. But, sometimes it gets complex. That was a simple query. Sometimes you get a kind of very complex, as is always the case with JSON, structure in your query. And the problem, of course, is that users don't want to be writing this kind of thing by hand. So sure, you could write this in FQL and submit it to FQM, but that would be kind of messy. So FQM has a query builder, which hopefully you've seen in the previous demo. So the query builder will take this query that's shown in blue on the left-hand side and essentially convert it into a nicely structured mechanism. On the right-hand side, you can build it up basically by adding the elements that you need, as was shown in the demo, I'm sure. And ultimately, this is just to give you the human version of what was being done here. In the bottom left, you can see that this is not an atypical type of query. This is something that might come up quite easily, but it does tend to, as is the case for most database-oriented queries, get to a very complex syntax. It's not so easy for humans to understand.
And actually, just something that's kind of fun about that query. About a week or two ago, someone asked a question in Slack about how to query the users by patron group and export it to CSV. And I thought to myself, if only we had some sort of app that could make that list in that query and then export it. And maybe someday. Anyway, that is the query that answers like that exact question. So totally a thing. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Well, the big question is, of course, how does FQM access data from other applications? So the way this works, it's probably the reveal you're all waiting for. FQM exposes data by accessing its own database schema. So in other words, FQM itself is consistent with the microservices model, where it has some data and it's in a schema that it has defined, and it just accesses it. Now, what FQM doesn't need to know is how the data gets into its own data structures, into its own table structures. So these table structures are general purpose. In other words, FQM will support a number of different mechanisms for getting this in here. You could build a Kafka-based event system that populates the data. You could use replication. You could use a number of things. You could also use database views for doing that. And that is what FQM in its present state has done. So FQM uses database views that are composable, that are composed for the purposes of answering specific queries and providing those answers. Did you want to say something about the entity types at this point? basically the result of one of these. A table that is revealed through a view represents the term we referred to before, which is the entity type. So we manage entity types on a one-to-one relationship with the views that create them. So, of course, there's always security concerns with all these things. And this becomes, particularly sensitive when you start getting into applications or modules that grant you access to the data found in other modules, because the modules depend on applications or modules will protect their own data with their own permissions. But if the data is somehow leaked out into a third application, such as FQM, then there's a risk for data. So FQM itself, the manager component, obviously it's a microservice. It has its own application structure. It has its own permission models to get you using into the APIs that it offers up, just like any other module or application in Folio. But we need to be a little more granular than that. So the entity types, which represent essentially each of those views that are being exposed, which will pull data in from other parts of Folio, need to have granularity of security on those. So FQM Manager maintains essentially its own access control over these in the form of semi-permissions that basically define who can access a particular view. Now, that's the current implementation of FQM. If some of you have seen some of the other presentations that have been going around, and particularly the ones about how we can formalize the structures of folios around applications, and there's another one coming up later today where we talk about roles and capabilities, a new model that could be added to Folio, that would be something that FQM could actually use. So I won't say more about that right now. Please come join us this afternoon. But it's a model which would allow us not only to have security levels at the granularity of the individual views or entity types, but actually partition them even further and say, well, you could go down to the source, so maybe you have access to this particular entity type from FQM, which pulls in data from users and circulation and inventory. But when you come down to check it, if you are not granted the capability to see, let's say, user data, then that would be excluded from your presentation of the FQM data. But that's a future feature. So we had a picture before where we showed the list app and the FQM underneath it. So if we expand the FQM box and we can see what composes FQM, FQM has its own application structure within Folio consisting of some backend modules here, and the manager is that module. We have data schemas that are defined as with any module and storage. There are two parts to that, really. One is the actual data that is pulled in from other sources and made available for FQM to report on. And then there's the piece of the schema, which is maintaining those definitions of the entity types and the mappings of them to whatever permissions are needed. So there's sort of internal management of the entity types within Folio in the FQM application. As you'll see here, there's a little asterisk in some of these because what this also lets you do is use read replicas if you don't want to be querying a live database a lot of times, so you want to create a read replica of your main database, and you can run FQM against that read replica, although the entity type definitions are managed on the primary. So FQM powers the list app, but it actually can do much more than that. And it's already been tagged as an enabler for many other features, some of which have been blocked within Folio because of this problem of pulling data in from different places and not wanting to have yet more coupling and dependencies between things. So I'll just go through some of these. So the bulk edit application is one which will need to have FQM. And in fact, the team that works on bulk edit is the team that helped build the UI component, because they're going to be using it too. So this query tool that we have in FQM is also going to be used and appearing in other places, notably bulk edit. The delete functionality has been brought up in other presentations. Essentially, Folio has a problem right now with the inability to delete records because there's no easy way to determine if a record actually has all the is safe to be deleted. It may be in use elsewhere. Data export. Similarly, data export needs to deal a lot of times with cross data applications, particularly when it comes to filtering the data that you want to export. Data import, our favorite application, data import, is those of you familiar with it and how it works, there are certain operations in data import which are particularly expensive, namely when you bring in a record into the system from data import. It's pretty easy if you're just creating a new record that doesn't exist. But if you bring in a record and you don't want to create a duplicate, you have to check whether it exists first. And there's a number of operations that are used for that purpose to see whether or not this record is already there, and it works by looking at a number of different fields. FQM could help with that by essentially streamlining the process and having a ready answer as to quickly identifying all the identifiers from different sources, which would help you determine whether a record already exists. There are other applications which could be added. And this is certainly not a comprehensive list. And obviously one area which I'm sure most people realize is that what we have is with FQM is a system that basically lets you cross the module boundary in a controlled fashion to which is ideal for doing sort of internal operational reporting within Folio. We have a very small handful of operational reports built into Folio currently. Those could be rewritten to make use of FQM and become a standardized template for how other reports could be created. So let me just drill down a little bit in some of these other ones that I mentioned here. So the bulk edit piece, so you get an appreciation of how useful this is. Bulk edit is a feature which allows you to essentially simultaneously apply changes to multiple records on a given entity. So you want to go in and change, some field on an item record in inventory, but obviously you don't want to hit all of them. So you need to filter it. You need to say, well, okay, but I only want to hit those records where the title starts with the letter Q, for example, for whatever reason. So bulk edit works by generating a query that first compiles the list of all the item IDs that you want to target. And then the second phase, it will give you the edit functionality and apply the change to those records identified. Well, that first phase, the querying, relies on conditions which may not be part of the item record itself, right? So you may want to say, I want to just filter on all the item records that have circulated in the last 29 days here. So you get a finite set of IDs. That requires going across the boundary. That requires being able to say, let me check circulation to see the last time these were lent out and when which IDs those correspond to. Those are the ones I want, but that's an inventory. So the FQM can help by bridging that gap and giving you a quick answer for selecting the items that you want to edit. The other one I mentioned was, it's a typo. It's FQM and delete functionality. So the other one is the delete functionality. So I'll go on about that a little bit. One of the main problems with Folio is records accumulate. There's no garbage collection, and again, this is probably even something that exacerbates the data import. Where if you do a large record import for 100,000 records, and if it fails, you start over. Well, those first 100,000 records, they may already have been put in the system, and you'll have a large number of orphaned MARC records, and that slows the whole system down. So you want to have a mechanism to remove those records that were put there, and this applies for just cleanup operations when you want to delete something from your inventory and so forth. There's no safe way to do that because you need to ensure that there's no other part of the system that's making use of that record. And there's high coupling, high dependencies within a Folio. And so an example here is like, you want to delete some item record and from inventory, and you have to check a dozen places to find out, are there any open loans on this thing? No. Are there pending requests? No. Are there pending orders, etc.? As you go down this list, if you get negative answers on everything, then okay, you're safe to delete it, or at least so you can assume. It's a rule-based mechanism that says for every one of these records, we can define the rules. Here are the things to check. Now, if you were to implement this in Folio right now, we're looking at, just on this screen, 6 calls to different APIs in each of those systems to get the answer, and that can be very expensive and difficult, and it's easy to miss it. So FQM comes to the rescue. So FQM can provide an entity type that in a single query, in a single table, can return to you all those columns. It will accumulate the data relative to these things and present them to you quickly. So you don't have to do multiple calls. You just call FQM and say, hey, is it safe to delete an item? And you get back an answer that has these columns and says, yes, and no needs, no dependency, no, you're good to delete. There you go. So this is something that that was obviously discovered and came up because this delete functionality has been designed. There's a working design for this that has been prototyped, and we want to deploy this in the next release of Folio possibly. But when the team started working at that proof of concept, they said, okay, well, I guess we have to build this query that does the thing. And wait a minute, FQM, let's use FQM. So FQM will come to the rescue and will be part of the delete functionality going forward as well. So that said, here's sort of a different kind of picture, a system view that will sort of show you where FQM fits in with everything. So FQM is in the center of the diagram here, and on top we have the green parts. This is FQM, and FQM, essentially you've got that central part here, which is sort of the manager, FQM manager, that lets you submit queries and get your responses. It's used by the List app, as we've seen here. It's going to be used by bulk edits. It's going to be used by the delete functionality. It's going to be used by a number of different components within Folio. So this is the big picture. And in the near future, not quite yet, but soon we'll have also an Edge API available off of FQM, which will allow external systems to tap into the mechanisms to allow reporting or other visualization tools to have access to Folio data. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. That went rather fast, I guess, but open it up for questions if anybody has any at this point.
And did we mention that it is going into the community code? It's not a
absolutely
exclusive thing. We want to make it available to everyone.
Yeah, so we are currently cleaning up the code itself, because the process is we need to submit this to the technical council, which has a stringent set of requirements, and rather than submit it and fail, we know what the requirements are. So we're going to clean it up so it gets through the first time. But we will shortly be submitting it to the tech council for submission, and all of this is going back to community code.
I'll run over with the microphone. You guys work as a software engineer and out of shape, so you're making me run.
Thank you. I was just in a workflow presentation, so I was kind of thinking about lists in the context of using workflows too. And I was wondering how you guys see these working together. At first, I thought they seemed redundant, but now I'm realizing that the workflow application may be able to use the lists application to drive it. Have you talked to that group at all or given that thought?
So I'll take that. No, we have not actually. I'm not overly aware of that workflow application at this point, but certainly is a possibility. I mean, this is what it's offering. It's part of that other in the bullets, where this is another use. Definitely. Give him a microphone up there.
The question is back to Arlington.
Yeah, I can't see it from here. Okay. So let's go back up here. How many questions do we have? All right, so I'm going to start from the top then. Is lists upcoming in a future release? So the answer there is we hope so. We hope to get it past the council and have it in the Q release, I believe.
Poppy.
Poppy, even better. So let's get our act together in the tech council. So yeah, there's the second question. That's the answer. It's gonna be part of the Poppy release, we hope. Sweet. Does the read replica need updating to keep up with live, or will it automatically keep up? So the answer is that they automatically keep up. That's sort of the fundamental role of a read replica.
Yeah, pretty much any database platform you use will have a read replica system built in. Sometimes it can be a few minutes behind. If you're using something like Amazon Aurora, it can be milliseconds behind. So it just depends on which database platform is being used to host the Folio DB.
So I guess we're getting to the question that was raised. Is there a timeline and priority list for extending lists? Records? Yeah. Beyond items and loans. Want to take that?
Probably your best bet would be to follow up with Kathleen more about that. It actually came up in the last presentation earlier. Where I believe the plan is hopefully to build some sort of roadmap to figure out what's going to go in when, because as I'm sure you guys are aware, it's a lot of work to get each one all set up and running. So,
but it's fair to say though that when developing this, getting that first list out there is the hard part. You know, we build the infrastructure for doing that. We build the machine. It's a machine. FQM is a machine. Adding additional ones will be incrementally smaller efforts, I think.
Yeah. Fortunately, the architecture does lend itself to making it pretty quick and straightforward to add new data fields to it. It's just a matter of going in and doing it. In fact, what we've shown already was just items and loans. We already have users about, I don't know, a third of the way done. We're just working on filling that out more. We'll see where we go from there.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, let me just ask you, is this something you all, oh, there's some questions up here. Cool.
Hey, engineer Ron, what are you doing?
Thank you. I apologize if this was covered and I missed it, but I was wondering, you know, when you create a list using the Lists app, you know, how persistent is that list that you create? How long does it last? You know, is it sort of a thing where you lose the list as soon as you close that window in Folio? Does it stick around for a couple of days? Do we set how much time we want a list to stick around? You know, just sort of in terms of, you know, just how long do they exist?
Mm-hmm. Well, the list app has its own storage, which is shown here in the diagram. So it retrieves data from FQM, but it has its own storage, and that storage is persisted really to the extent that you want it to persist as the creator of the list. And you can manipulate that list. You can refresh the list if things go away, but it is a tool that is designed to persist the list, and it creates it based on a snapshot of data, but that data will be updated at the field level when necessary.
We mentioned earlier that an entity type has to have an ID in it somewhere. That's actually the thing that the Lists app stores. It doesn't store any of the rest of the data from the entire data set that it gets from the query. It stores the ID. That way it can look it up later just based on the ID alone. And so that persists as long as you want it to. The upshot to that is it makes it very lightweight. It's a single UUID for each record in the list. So we're not making giant copies of data or, you know, multi-gigabyte tables just to store a list. It's a pretty lean data structure. Vince, look at those because I saw a hand.
Okay. All right. Question was here, can you have multiple lists? Absolutely. you have a good number of lists. Kathleen, do we even have limits on the number you can have? Not at this point, no. So that's an improvement over that other lists application, by the way. The question, if I install or uninstall a new module, how does the app know? So that's the question. So I believe that essentially you create your entity types based on the data that's available, but you have to have knowledge of that. So do you have anything to add to that, Matt, or do you have a microphone?
Yeah, you could, a couple of different options that we've considered. One is right now it is based on views that point at other tables. And so you could replace that with just a dummy stubbed out thing that would just make it kind of function. Another option would be to add the entity type that you want later. You don't necessarily need to have them all up front. So you can hold off on adding the entity types until the underlying data is available and then put them in at that time. That would work too.
So I had two questions, but I think I saw one of them actually pop up in the questions in chat. So I'll just go to the second one. I'm thinking about the overlap or intersection with this and the enhanced consortial support. So have you guys thought about how this might work in a consortia setting where information might span multiple tenants?
We haven't formalized anything yet. I know the team's been bouncing around some ideas. One idea that would probably be the simplest to implement. Again, no idea if this is what we'll do or if it's final in any way. But one idea would be to add new entity types that correspond to the different types of consortial reports or lists you want to build. It would be pretty trivial to add a new entity type that spans all of the available tenants within your consortia in that system. Or you could make entity types that are very custom to go to specific bits and pieces however you want. There's one really nice upside to the approach of using views is we can make the views do whatever we want. Again, that's not even remotely final. It's just one of the ideas.
Question in chat, maybe this is the one Craig was referring to, but it says, do you foresee the FQM Edge API as being the structure for FOLIO reporting in the future? So that's kind of a yes and no question, because FOLIO reporting is a general topic, and in previous conversations, it really breaks down to different types of reporting. So there's operational reporting, and there's sort of analytical reporting that it provides insight. Then there's reports that are, in some cases, just simply producing lists because reports have been used for this in the past. So on the one hand, I think some of the future relies with the list app. If you're just trying to get lists of things, sometimes reporting is actually used as a substitute for exports. So data export is that part of the solution. Operational reporting, I do think, could be done within FOLIO using FQM, not necessarily the list app. And the FQM export mechanism would probably be used for analytics type of operations that want to take the data out of FOLIO and gain additional insights by cross-referencing it with other systems that you have access to, whether it's student information, curriculum information, financial information of the institution. Is grouping of Boolean operators possible in the query syntax or via API, in the query builder or via API? So grouping of Boolean. So I'm not sure that it supports direct Boolean operations at all. The examples I had, and I'm not an expert on it, Matt, maybe you know better, but the syntax support a simplified version of what SQL could offer. As you saw in the example, there was an in operator, which I guess is an or. I'm not sure. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, right now we don't support Boolean operations, largely just because we haven't had a good use case for it. But we are wide open to more use cases because we do want the tool to be very useful and don't want it to just wither on the vine because it doesn't do what people want. So are definitely wide open to any kind of enhancements you have.
Right. And sometimes Boolean operations are used as grouping mechanisms, as the question states. And since this query syntax is essentially JSON based, it can support nesting, and many times you can reformulate your query in the form of a nested query to answer the question, maybe even more efficiently that way.
And by design, we're trying very hard to not make it as powerful as SQL, because if you give the world something as powerful as SQL, which is a Turing complete language, it's going to get abused very, very heavily. So what we're trying to do is build a system that constrains what you can do to the degree that you're not going to accidentally bring down the system with a weird query that's way too powerful, but it's powerful enough to do what you want. So we're definitely working on figuring out exactly where that fine line is. So again, wide open to suggestions because we do want it to be useful.
Right. And there was another question here. PK answered it online, but the question was, will work intensive queries affect the FOLIO performance? Straight answer is yes. And that's why we recommend that FQM itself be run on a read replica so that it doesn't affect the operational transactions of FOLIO while it's running. This is a very quiet audience.
It is.
I'm not used to this. I guess everybody's retired now. It's Thursday.
We both have pretty quiet voices too. I think we're just setting a vibe.
Sorry, I should. And maybe I'm putting him to sleep. I guess I'm practicing my NPR voice. All right. Anything more?
Oh, Ian's making me run again.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I came in a little late, so if I missed this, apologies. This is all really cool. I want to look more at it. Is there a repo that I can poke through at this point?
There will be next week, I believe.
Score. Thank you.
I think we're moving it into the FOLIO org on GitHub as part of our preparation to submit it to the Tech Council for approval.